Tonight, inflation sticks. The latest report shows easing, but still high inflation, putting the Fed in a sticky situation over interest rate hikes in the face of two failed banks. Plus,
he was actually quite a successful businessman.
The biblical case for innovators and investors. And
blacklisting disinformation.
A secretive, dynamic exclusion list, essentially a blacklist, of the websites that it determines to be the biggest purveyors of disinformation online.
And the targeting of conservative websites.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. High prices persist despite efforts to rein in inflation. Welcome to Faith Nation from our studio in Washington. I'm John Jessup.
And good evening, I'm Jenna Browder. New inflation numbers out today show prices still high as Americans continue to spend more than they did last year.
The Federal Reserve's months-long proactive measures designed to tackle rising prices may actually have contributed to the two recent bank collapses. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us with more. Matt, the government looks like it's trying to strike this delicate balance as it navigates this fragile financial situation.
Yeah, John and Jenna, fragile is right. The Federal Reserve Chair told Congress last week they were prepared to increase rate hikes and quicken the pace to try and get a handle on inflation, but that might not be the case now. Inflation remains stubbornly high, according to the latest Consumer Price Index. February numbers lined up with economists' expectations, although prices are still 6% higher than 1 year ago and increased slightly from January. Housing costs accounted for a big chunk of the increase, even with energy prices falling.
You take all your money.
But two large bank failures over the weekend have complicated the economic picture. Both Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank collapsed, forcing federal regulators to make emergency moves to guarantee customers get their money, even those with more than the federally insured amount of $250,000. Some experts believe the banks were caught up in the Fed's attempt to reel in inflation with rate hikes.
Rising interest rates was one of the biggest problems that bit them two ways.
Federal Chair Jerome Powell told Congress just last week that faster and larger rate hikes could be on the horizon.
If the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes.
But the banking collapses and economic news may have slowed that plan for now. Wall Street rallied Tuesday morning after the economic news and a bet on a smaller rate hike, while President Biden assured Americans about the bank system being safe. He also wants Congress to work on preventing any more banks from folding.
I'm going to ask Congress and the banking regulators to strengthen the rules for banks to make it less likely this kind of bank failure would happen again.
Meanwhile, Facebook's parent company, Meta, told employees they're planning to lay off about 10,000 workers and not fill 5,000 open positions, citing economic uncertainty. The Fed meets next week and is expected to go forward with a rate hike, although there's optimism it will be a smaller one. John and Jenna.
All right, Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka. Thank you, Matt. Well, here with us now is Joel Griffith, research fellow in the Rowe Institute at the Heritage Foundation. Joe, welcome. As you just heard, a little bit of sour news that Matt ended with Meta. Beyond the big takeaways, though, inflation remains high, especially in the services sector. Joel, do you see any positive signs from this latest inflation report?
No, there's very little positive in here. In fact, what we saw was that year over year, real wages declined for a record 23 months in a row. So pretty much the entirety of the Biden presidency, we have seen year over year wage decreases. And that's because, as we've all felt, the cost of living continues to rise more rapidly than our paychecks are rising. And I think it's important to note here that blame does not lie entirely with President Biden, although he has been an abject failure in terms of economic performance. But this goes back now 3 years, and Republicans and Democrats in Congress passed massive spending bills to distribute money across the country. President Trump signed those measures into law, and the central bank printed the money to buy up the government debt to make it possible. We are reaping what we have sown over the past 3 years.
Joel, Moody's today cut its outlook on the U.S. banking system to negative. This after the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the smaller Signature Bank over the weekend. Is this indicative of a more widespread financial weakness in the system?
Oh, the financial weakness in the banks goes far beyond the woke capitalists at SVB and at SBNY. And here's what's happened. You had trillions of dollars worth of new deposits that were put on hand at these banks, courtesy of the Fed printing all of that money. And the banks went ahead and bought a lot of long-term government debt. Now, as interest rates rise, the value of that long-term debt at those lower interest rates declines. Now, all is well and good until depositors want their money back. Well, if depositors want that money back, that means that those banking institutions need to cash in their investments at a loss. And that's what sparked the bank run over the last weekend. But this goes far beyond just those two banks, because you have banks across the country that have put those deposit dollars in those longer term investments, and those investments have lost value over the past few years. And now you heard from the Fed chair, now the Fed is basically promising to bail out not just these depositors who would have lost their money, but they're basically bailing out future banks as well, because they're offering these very generous loan terms in exchange for the banks putting up those losing investments as collateral. It's a bailout for those depositors, and now it's a bailout for banks across the country.
All right, we have to leave it there. Joel Griffith with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Well, a dangerous incident over international waters in the skies near Ukraine. Russian fighter jets colliding with the rear propeller of an unmanned U.S. military drone, forcing the United States military to down the drone into the Black Sea.
It is not uncommon, Amr, for there to be intercepts by Russian aircraft of U.S. aircraft over the Black Sea. But this one obviously is noteworthy because of how unsafe and unprofessional it was, indeed reckless that it was, and causing the downing of one of our aircrafts.
The U.S. European Command added in a statement that the two Russian Su-27 fighter jets were conducting an unsafe intercept when one clipped the MQ-9 Reaper drone.
Meanwhile, a new report finds terrorist attacks declining in the West, but still growing deadlier in the Middle East and Africa.
According to the 2023 Global Terrorism Index, the Islamic State, or ISIS as it's more commonly known, remains at the top of the world's deadliest group, due in part to its members capitalizing on regional instability as worldwide attention focuses on the war in Ukraine. CBN national security correspondent Caitlin Burke has been looking into the report all day. Caitlin, how serious is the overall terror threat?
John, Jenna, in their annual report, the Institute of Economics and Peace finds that while the dynamics of terrorism are changing, the threat remains high. Experts warn that any kind of complacency, especially by world powers, could lead to serious consequences in the future.
Maintaining focus is really important despite all the competing priorities that are out there.
The Hudson Institute's Joshua Meservey points to the Biden administration's shifting focus away from the war on terror to pay attention to the growing concerns with China and Russia.
So it makes sense that there's been a pivot, but there is a danger there that we lose sight of these terrorist organizations that are still totally committed to attacking the United States, or if they can't hit the American homeland, would attack Americans or American interests in whatever region they're in.
This year's index indicates that Western counterterrorism efforts over the last 2 decades continue to pay off, showing a decline in attacks. Meservey points out, however, that doesn't mean terror organizations have been less active. They've just moved on to countries facing greater instability.
There has been a real shift to Africa, specifically the Sahel region, where we've seen a greater growth in terrorist activity than anywhere else in the world.
He notes that region of Africa faces frequent food shortages, poverty, and corrupt leadership.
There's an enabling environment that exists in these countries where you have kleptocratic, even abusive governments, and that helps the terrorists, frankly. It makes their ideology more attractive. It makes the message that they're sending to ordinary people more attractive.
The Islamic State remains the world's deadliest terror group for the 8th year in a row, with Afghanistan feeling the highest impact from terror attacks.
You have a terrorist organization that runs the country now, so it's really unsurprising, but it's also a reminder of just how badly the United States botched both the Afghanistan withdrawal and other elements of that war.
The IEP is calling on world powers to tackle terrorism by addressing systemic issues in places like Africa, where governments seem less likely to stamp out violent extremism and people appear more likely to be taken in by radical ideologies. John, Jenna?
All right. Thank you, Caitlin. For Republicans, the 2024 race for the White House begins in Iowa. Coming up, what former President Trump's star power in the Hawkeye state means for his Republican rivals and the GOP.
Welcome back to Election 2024. Former President Trump dubbing his third bid for the White House the final battle. Speaking in Iowa Monday, Trump took aim at the economy, the border, and likely 2024 opponent of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Ron DeSantis. Did anyone ever hear of DeSantis? The sanctimonious DeSantis. No, Ron DeSantis strongly opposed ethanol. Do you know that? And we don't even know if he's running, but I might as well tell you. If he's not running, I'll say he was fine on ethanol. Ron was a disciple of Paul Ryan, who is a rhino loser.
And Trump also attacked DeSantis over his position on Social Security and Medicare entitlements. And fittingly, for the Iowa speech, the former president billing himself as the most pro-farmer president.
Well, for a deeper dive, let's bring in CBN chief political analyst David Brody. I was about to change your title there, David. I'm sorry. So former President Trump spoke to a standing room crowd of over 3,500 in Davenport, another 1,200 plus people outside at an event that was reportedly shutting down traffic early afternoon. David, what does that suggest of polls and surveys that say Republicans are ready to move on from Mr. Trump?
Yeah, they're not. Look, John, there's been a lot of ink written about it's time to move past Trump. But here's the truth, and here's the, call it the dirty little secret that a lot of folks in the Republican Party don't want to admit, and that is the energy is still with Trump. And what do I mean by the energy? Let's define that. I'm talking about the populist folks inside the movement, the MAGA movement. They are the Energizer bunnies, plural. They are the activists. They're the ones that actually get off the couch and go to those rallies and organize and all of that. Then there's the traditional Republicans. They're like, want, sad, sad. I don't like Trump, boo-hoo. But they don't do anything about it, and they like Ron DeSantis. Well, great. But that's not where the energy is right now. Now, that could change. We will wait and see. That's why they have a primary. But right now, the energy is all with Donald Trump.
So, you know, we're still waiting to hear from Ron DeSantis if he actually makes an announcement to run. David, does he have a shot at all? And if not this time around, maybe he would run in another 4 years in 2028?
He definitely has a shot. There's no doubt about it. And if Ron DeSantis was looking in the mirror, this is what he would say to the mirror. Hey, Ron, I've got a shot. And that's what he would say. He knows it. I mean, look, if you look at some of the latest polls, the Monmouth poll, look at evangelical support. He has a better favorability rating among evangelicals right now, DeSantis does, than Trump, 82% to 80%. So it's close. Everybody else, Nikki Haley, others, Pence, way behind. So sure, he has a shot, but there is this sense, Jen, and I'm glad you brought that up, that there are people that say, look, we love you, but we'll love you more in 4 years. So just give it a rest. You're not 79 years old. You know, you're not on Medicare yet. And I guess nowadays you have to be on Medicare to run for president. I don't know. But the bottom line is give it a rest and let Trump have this final hurrah, if you will, or as he calls it, the final battle.
All right, CBN News chief political analyst, got it right that time, David Brody. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Well, turning to Israel and an event bringing together business innovators with investors who could help turn their ideas into reality.
Pointing to what they say is biblical success stories, the gathering mixed the business world with the spiritual world. CBN's Paul Strand has more from Jerusalem.
A number of believers are uncomfortable mixing the Almighty and money. They point to scriptures such as Matthew 6, verse 24, that decrees you cannot serve both God and money. Entrepreneur John Medved, founder of Our Crowd, begs to differ. He says people, like those at this Investors Summit, need to examine the innovation and faith displayed by Israel's founding fathers and how that led to wealth. It goes all the way back to Abraham.
He was actually quite a successful businessman. He was, they say actually, even in Hebrew, he kaved b'tzon. He was heavy with flock. You know, whenever you talk about a guy who's like a heavy investor, Abraham was that kind of a person. His son, Isaac, drilled wells. He was a hydrologist. Okay, when you read the Bible, you realize that he was like Israel's first water expert. And his son, Jacob, was a biotechnologist. Remember what he did with his flocks in terms of changing their colors and stripes, okay, and how to breed them. His son, Joseph, was the mashbir, was this incredible private-public partner guy. He ran all of Egypt, which was the economic powerhouse at the time. So this goes all the way back into our DNA. This is what Israel is supposed to be doing.
Medved points out if people will follow these examples, walk in their own giftings, and strive to make the world a better place, God will bless their efforts. As the book of Proverbs puts it, great wealth is in the house of the righteous, and lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thank you, Paul. Well, a list of the 10 riskiest websites for companies to advertise on, and they all lean to the right politically. Up next, why some say it's the latest attempt to stop free speech.
Well, critics say a new movement is underway to blacklist certain speech by labeling it disinformation, leading some to decry to the deterioration of freedom of speech.
As Dale Hurd reports, those being labeled as, say, another example of cancel culture, with a goal of convincing companies to stop advertising on conservative websites.
Companies are being steered away from spending advertising dollars with conservative news websites by what's been labeled a stealth blacklisting operation. The British Global Disinformation Index says its mission is to disrupt the business model of disinformation. To reduce disinformation, we need to remove the financial incentive to create it. The index has the potential to economically strangle some conservative websites. Investigative reporter Gabe Kaminsky uncovered the operation for the Washington Examiner.
GDI compiles a secretive dynamic exclusion list, essentially a blacklist, of the websites that it determines to be the biggest purveyors of disinformation online.
The Global Disinformation Index lists the 10 riskiest websites for companies to advertise with. All are conservative or libertarian, including the New York Post, Reason, the Daily Wire, and the American Conservative. They're accused of things like lack of transparency, bias, or omissions of pertinent information. We asked the senior editor at the American Conservative, Rod Dreher, for his response to the claim his website is risky.
My response is, we are an opinion magazine. Of course we're biased. Liberal opinion magazines are biased too.
But no liberal or mainstream media websites are listed as risky by the index, which is funded by several foundations, including George Soros' Open Society Foundations, and even the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Or at least it was until members of Congress got wind and the funding was canceled. This is only the latest wave of cancel culture to hit conservatives, who have already been shadow banned, deplatformed, debanked, and even mentioned for deprogramming.
And the question is, how are we going to really almost deprogram these people?
As conservatives began to be banned from social media, they thought that at least they would be safe on their own websites. But the censors have followed. While Republicans in Congress are vowing to investigate the Global Disinformation Index, Dreher, the author of The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation, does not believe this censorship campaign will stop anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't think it ever will stop, because the other side, they're motivated by a religious fervor. They are fighting evil, and you can't tolerate evil. They have identified the enemy. The enemy are those who are so-called deplorables, including conservative Christians and others, who they will deem to be threats, and therefore they can be marginalized.
The recent issue of Rolling Stone magazine features an article called Why Cancel Culture is Good for Democracy. Stephen Sokup, author of The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, says corporate America is easy prey for programs like the Global Disinformation Index.
This is a continuation of a trend in American history of an elite ruling class that believes that they're, sort of the benevolent guardians who are taking care of the poor, stupid American people who don't understand what they really need and what they really want and what's really best for them.
In an attempt to fight back against corporate cancel culture, a conservative watchdog group called the 1792 Exchange recently released its corporate bias ratings. It rates more than 1,000 companies on their likelihood to cancel a contract or client or deny services based on a person's beliefs. And the future could see even more censorship. A Manhattan Institute study found that while the American public leans 2-to-1 in favor of free speech, most Americans under 30 favor censorship when free speech hurts certain groups.
Freedom of religion, freedom of association, all the First Amendment freedoms, they are overwhelmingly intolerant of these freedoms. They do not want to support free speech, freedom of religion, or anything like that if the exercise of those freedoms stands to hurt a vulnerable minority.
We invited the Global Disinformation Index to answer the charges made against it, but they did not respond. They're now being accused of spreading disinformation themselves for warning advertisers to blacklist news sites that blamed the COVID pandemic on a lab leak in China, a claim the FBI and the U.S. Department of Energy believe to be true. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Coming up, supporting East Palestine through small acts of kindness. Next on Faith Nation.
And finally tonight, more than a month after the toxic train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, a mission to let the people there know they are not being forgotten.
That's right. While the work to help the community recover continues, messages of support are pouring in. A group of Cleveland students recently traveled to East Palestine armed with hundreds of handwritten cards and signs of encouragement delivered to the families affected by the toxic spill. The kids say they wanted to do anything they could to help out, offering words of kindness and showing that they care. And who says that there's not good news these days?
Yeah, that's really sweet. Gosh, my heart, though, it just goes out to the people of East Palestine.
Yep.
They're in a really, really hard situation.
It's going to take a while for the recovery to take place, but they still are in people's thoughts and prayers.
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right, that's going to do it for Faith Nation.
Have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow.